So hi there, welcome to those of you who have already connected. I'm Simon Wallace, I am one of the committee members of the Consultancy Specialist Group. So let me just introduce Rebecca George, and she's, until very recently, was a managing partner at Deloitte, managing the government and public services area, which was a scope of 25 different countries. It was a really interesting role. And the other thing of great interest to us in the BCS, of course, is that she is our immediate past president of the BCS. And I think I should also say that she was honoured with an OBE in 2006 for her work with the government on sustainable communities. So we are really very honoured and delighted to have Rebecca speaking this evening, and I won't say anything more about her bio because I know she's got a slide coming up where she'll just say a bit more about who she is. So I think with no more ado, Rebecca, let me hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and good evening, everyone. I am delighted to be back with the Consultancy Specialist Group, one of my very favourite specialist groups in the BCS. So I am going to be speaking for about 50 minutes. I'm just looking at my clock, maybe just slightly over. Simon said a couple of things about me, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but I just did want to say I've spent 40 years doing digital transformation, and a lot of it has been around consultancy and delivering services for clients. And I've been involved with the BCS since 1997. And you catch me at an interesting time in my BCS career because I've just done my last trustee board. And next week or the week after, I'll be chairing my final nominations committee and remunerations committee. And thereafter, I'll just be an ordinary member of NomCom, not on the board or holding any high office. I'm not going away from BCS. But it's a change of role for me. I wanted to mention that I am leading the search for a new group CEO, and I will continue to do that until we find a candidate. The ad will be up on LinkedIn in the next few days. I will make sure that you've got it. If there's anybody in your networks who you think would be good for that role, or you're interested, please do get in touch. And the final thing I wanted to say is, very excitingly, I have recently been appointed as the independent chair of the Skills Reform Board for the Department of Education. And this board is overseeing skills reform in further education and lifelong learning. Some of you will know I've been involved with T-levels for a few years. And so this is an expansion of that role, looking at the whole of the reform programme. It's actually really exciting. There's a lot going on, and there's a big review going on of technical qualifications in particular. It's a great opportunity for me to talk a lot about the value of IT professionalism, something which I'm incredibly passionate about. Right, moving on. I've got this holdings slide. This is really about the fact that you can't possibly tell what's going to happen. How could any of us have possibly told we'd be doing this 2 years ago? But you can have, in my opinion, a kind of toolkit that can help you to be ready and react, respond, and manage completely unlikely situations. As we've seen, problem solving, gathering evidence and analysing the facts, having a great team around you, having a lot of common sense, and in my personal experience, a good sense of humour, all those help as a kind of toolkit of things that you can have in your back pocket just in case the next thing happens that you're not ready for. Right, moving on. I'm romping through my first slides because I really want to get onto a discussion about what's the face of consultancy going to look like post-COVID, and what will we be doing as consultants? How will we be working, interacting with our clients and colleagues? So I'm going to just use these few slides now to set the scene, but I really want to get into that discussion in a little while. So we are in a massively volatile and uncertain environment, and all businesses are really kind of struggling with how to make sense of continual change around them. What I've observed is that most business leaders are, in these particular cases, most interested in control. This is not a time that you're going to find global organizations doing big decentralization. It's much more likely that you'll have the CFO and the COO maintaining quite a tight grip on the organization. So I think that all of the kind of financial management, monitoring performance, customer service, reputation management, security, all of this is about having control over the business and trying to dampen down those areas where you might have a shock. I've added some specifics around SMEs at the bottom because I do think this is a particularly hard time for SMEs. SMEs oftentimes are not in services. Sometimes they are, but often they're not. It can be harder to work remotely, and they are much more kind of vulnerable to the shocks of the environment. You know, particularly around things like supply chain issues, freight costs. You know, introduction of new Brexit red tape than larger organisations. And as the vast majority of the companies in this country are SMEs, then we need to take that into consideration. Moving on. The incoming president of BCS is a fantastic chap called Mayank Prakash, and he is a very experienced CIO. And when I knew that I was going to be doing this talk, I said to him, so, you know, what's keeping CIOs awake at night? And these are the top 4 things that he said to me. And just as an aside, he's definitely somebody you might want to invite to speak to this group at some point. But proving the value of technology in business cases, this is actually linked back to the previous slide where I talked about having control, having business control. Digital transformation and IT projects are famous, aren't they, for expanding their scope, maybe coming in late, perhaps going over budget. And CIOs are under a lot of pressure from the rest of the exec to say, you know, this is what we're doing, this is the scope of it, here's the business case, yes, we're on track, yes, we are delivering to schedule, and no, we're not going to go over budget, or if you are, staying very early. I think also that CIOs are much more likely to be asked for the evidence of measurable outcomes, measurable change in digital transformation going forward. And I know, you know, some of the really, really big projects that are going on at the moment, particularly, for example, around SAP HANA and cloud computing, you know, covering companies operating globally. Those are the ones where particularly the CIOs are absolutely under intense scrutiny around the business case and the value that they're delivering to the business. Security and all that goes with it. I mean, you know, I'm not going to go on this. You all know we're living every day in a world where people that we don't want to get into our systems. And it's a relentless struggle to keep our systems and processes and organizations and people secure. Agile digital transformation, this is your life. It's been my life for a long time. It often does feel like that you're rebuilding the aeroplane while you're flying through the air. And sometimes you start rebuilding the back end when you haven't finished putting the front end in place. And it's a continual kind of change process. And there's a huge amount of that going on. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then talent. So you would have seen this on the previous slide as well. There are never enough people. I mean, I think most organizations that are in any kind of services provision at the moment have vacancies and are looking for talent. And they're looking for good talent with the right skills. And those people are not necessarily always available. Okay, moving on. IT keeps relentlessly changing. You all know this. You will know about all the new technologies that are coming along. I have added assurance on there because I think it's massively important. I do think that we, at our peril, forget to assure our systems on a regular basis to make sure that what's coming out is what we expect, and that there aren't any glitches that have emerged without us noticing. I'm slightly biased in this area. I came from the risk management insurance part of Deloitte, but I do think that assuring digital systems is difficult and really important. And if you don't get that right, it's hard to get lots of other things right. Often the trick for companies when they're looking at all this new tech is, when do I adopt it? I don't want to be a first mover. That's too risky. But I don't want to be so late I might lose competitive advantage. So when is that sweet, fast follower spot? When should I pick up the new technology? And moving on, please, Simon. So what about consultants and consultancy? I think the market's really hot. I shall be very interested to hear what you have to say about this. My observation is that there's a lot of opportunity for consultants at the moment. That is partly because of the fact that everybody says they need talent. And one of the roles of consultants, not the only one, but one of them is to provide those particular skills that organizations need and don't necessarily have on their books long term, either because they shouldn't have to, it's not their core competency, or because they can't get them and train them and retain them in time. But I do think there's a lot of work around. There's lots of change, new, faster, more agile digital transformations. And the CIOs and the IT departments always seem to have more to do and more on their waiting list to do than they can possibly fulfill. There's more focus on the business case, which is good for consultants. I mean, being able to say, this is what our business case looks like, and this is what we're going to spend on external support. This is how long we're going to need it for, and this is when we're going to roll it off. Actually, that's quite good. I've always preferred working with that kind of client as a consultant myself. People want to challenge mainstream thinking. And this, I put this in thinking about a podcast I was listening to the other day on thinking. And the central argument here was that we give more credence to evidence or reports or research which back up our inherent point of view than those which challenge it. And I think as consultants, it's really important, isn't it, that we do properly think about, are we gathering evidence? Are we analysing the data before we make decisions? Or are we biasing our opinion towards those areas which naturally we think might be right or we feel more comfortable with? I think there's lots of opportunity for new relationships. I thought for a long time, collaboration, partnership, risk sharing, all of these things are really important for consultants. And it's just as important for subcontractors as it is for large organizations. But that relationship management continues to be really important. Something we'll talk about in a few minutes when we start talking about working from home. Keeping on evolving. What I did when I left Deloitte was nothing like I did when I joined, and certainly a million miles away from when I worked for Robert Maxwell in the cable television industry in the 1980s. I think you have to keep on evolving. The environment is changing, and your clients will expect you to be up to date. You have to keep moving. But there is that decision point, isn't there, about when do you specialise, when do you generalise, and what point in your career do you do one thing or the other. I'm very interested in inclusive system design and also addressing digital poverty and the digital inequalities, which have arisen particularly starkly, we see through COVID. I don't think there are any systems that any of us design which do not have a wider impact in some way, shape or form on society. And I think we have to bear that in mind as consultants in all the work that we do. Thank you, Simon. Right, I'm going to ask Simon to just stop sharing his screen for a couple of minutes so I can see your beautiful faces. I'm just going to make my screen larger here. Okay, if you can bear to switch on your cameras for a couple of minutes. If not, I don't know whether you've got, I don't actually know whether you've got a raised hand icon. I don't on mine, but let's see how we get on. I was just wanting to know who has not worked from home during the pandemic. who on this call, if anybody has not worked from home, can they make themselves, can they say or wave a hand or, yeah, is that thumb up, John, because you have worked from home or because you haven't worked from home? Keep it up if you haven't worked from home. Okay, so that's one. All right, and how many of you are back on your client site or in the office now? Put your thumbs up if you're back. Leave them down if you're still at home. Yeah, I've got Bill and Yolanda. Okay, so that's a couple of you back. Okay, and I've got a couple of thumbs down. Does that mean that you're back but you don't like it? We might have to get into a discussion about this in a few minutes. Let's try a different thumb. I quite like these thumbs up and thumbs down. Put your thumb up if you enjoyed working from home or if you're enjoying working from home. Ooh, well, you like that question. Yeah, I know, it's good, isn't it? I liked it too. Yeah, thank you. And final question for now is, put your thumb up if you think you will carry on the same as you are now. Or if you think it's i.e. working from home. You're still mainly working from home. Okay. Good. Excellent. That's given me a good feeling for the people in the group. So thank you very much for that. I wanted to have a bit of discussion about what we think might happen next around where consultants will work and how they will work. I think this is emerging thinking. There are some very important decisions for organisations to make. I think there's a whole kind of raft of stuff about who needs to be in the office. Do more junior people need to be in the office? What about leadership? What about impromptu mentoring and coaching? What about the social fabric that being in the office provides you? What about watching more senior people dealing with difficult situations or difficult clients? Isn't that how more junior people learn the job? And how are they going to do that if they are just at home on their own? And what about different types of work? Is brainstorming new ideas? Do you have to be in a room to do that? Is it easier? Or is it just as good if you use technology and do it remotely? So those are the kinds of things that I think we're going to get into discussing. Before we get there, I thought it would be worth just summarising what some other people are saying about this. Simon, can we have the next slide on, please? Thank you. One after that one. So the CIPD, the Institute for Personnel Development, has an ongoing research study, and I've just popped up here their preliminary findings. And, you know, this is emerging thinking. I don't think anyone would claim to know what all the answers are. We're not out of the pandemic yet, but we have had nearly 2 years of experience. So I think that quite a lot of their preliminary findings are fairly obvious. There isn't anything there that I looked at and thought, I wonder, I'm surprised to see that. I thought their preliminary recommendations were very interesting though. I am particularly interested in the first one. Be aware of the difference between standard and COVID-enforced home working. So I do think it was different, wasn't it? Back in, March 2020, when we all suddenly were at home, we were all of us anyway, doing the kinds of jobs we're doing, we were all at home. And very quickly, we had to adjust to that, adjust to the technology, and work out how to keep going. And we did. We did work that out, and we did keep going. And I do think there is a difference between that crisis-driven behaviour compared with people who choose to work from home and want to have it as part of their contract, if you like, psychological or actual, between them and the organisation they work for. I also think it's quite right and agree with their second point, which is that home working is here to stay. I think that, and I will be really interested to see what you think. I suspect most people will want to divide their time between working in the office or on a client site and working from home. The balance is going to be interesting. And the balance is going to be interesting, as I said earlier, depending on whether you're more junior in your career or more senior, and what you want, and also I think what kind of job you're doing and what the nature of the activities are. But I also think people are going to want to work from home, and they're going to want that flexibility. And you indicated that with your thumbs a couple of minutes ago. So designing jobs, taking that into consideration, I think is going to be important. Thank you. Next slide. McKinsey have a couple of studies going at the moment. Again, very interesting, always well researched. You can see the numbers here. I'm not surprised with these numbers. Like CIPD, they point out that not commuting is the biggest bonus. People are really liking, surprise, surprise, not getting up at crack of dawn and going and catching a train for an hour or so and then having a bit of a tube ride at whatever it is at the other end, and having to do that at the beginning and end of every day. I think, I said earlier about control. CFOs are looking at, well, we could make some savings here. I'm always interested in my cash control situation. Maybe I can claw back some of what we're spending on office space. And my interest from you is it too early for them to be saying that? Should they be just waiting a bit to see how things pan out? Or do you think, go for it, close down some offices, we won't be coming back? Or should they be thinking about reinvesting that money in different types of working space, maybe shared with other organisations, which are much closer to where their employees actually work? So you give people the opportunity to go and work with other people if they want to, not necessarily with people from your own team, but without that commute. And then they have an interesting table, McKinsey, about the types of activity which they have worked out, think have the highest potential for remote working. And I was quite interested in this. Updating knowledge and upskilling was top of their list. But when I thought about it, I thought, well, actually, I can see that. You're taking a course online, you're learning what you would learn in the classroom. If it's a good course, you're going to learn. And you can see then the others of the top 5 that McKinsey list, and they are all about consulting. They are all about consulting. And I mean, there's kind of no surprise there, because those activities which are lowest on their list are things like caring and nursing and being a medical person, which is clearly very difficult to do, as we know, entirely online. So moving on, conscious of time, I want now to start a conversation, and I don't think there have been a huge number of comments in the chat, but I did think it would be worth starting a conversation now, because this isn't an area where I think you've got any hard and firm answers. But I would love to hear from you about some of these questions and anything else that you want to raise. So do you think that enforced working from home work, because mainly, particularly senior people, were already either well established in their organisation or well established in their skills and experience and the roles they were doing with clients? So, they already knew how to act, if you see what I mean. They weren't trying to do brand new things or learn brand new things. And maybe a lot of the more junior people were doing much more kind of repetitive process type activities. Do you think it's worked because it was seen as temporary? Or do you think it's worked because people have gone, I love this and I'm never going to stop doing it? I love your views. And what about cultures of organisations and those communities that exist within organisations? Do you know what? I think some of the best communities that exist are those which are completely informal, and the organisation didn't set them up. They just sort of happened. And they can be immensely valuable. I used to love bumping into people in the coffee queue in the cafe downstairs and just, having a chat with them randomly and seeing what came up. I learned so many things I wouldn't otherwise know. And I did feel a lack of that when I started working entirely on Zoom and Teams. And then do different parts of projects, thinking about consultancy assignments with clients. Different parts of projects and assignments need different approaches. For example, would you expect to be more on client side in the initiation phase, then maybe away from the client side, but perhaps back again when you get to recommendations and final report, just as an example. And then the other thing that McKinsey, but also the OECD point out is, and does this only work for countries like the UK and the US and others which have advanced economies, mainly or a lot of professional services and good digital infrastructure and connectivity. Do you think that, and what effect will that have? Do you think that we'll have more of a digital divide globally? You know, there is an argument which says if you don't ever go to the office, why live in the country that you're working in? Conversely, why should your employer only hire expensive people from the UK when maybe they could get cheaper people from elsewhere? And will patchy infrastructure in the UK hold us back? I am crossing my fingers that you've heard everything that I've said to you, because I live in Somerset. And I have a usually great mobile Wi-Fi service provided by EE, but it's not always great, and it is patchy, no question. And you know, would it hold me back? Maybe it would. Right, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
We have a few comments in line. The first one was from Bill Kelly, and he was commenting that with the increase of global working teams, there was already a familiarity with the remote teaming. Now, coupled with the advance in technology like Zoom, for example, that enabled remote working, the transition in the lockdown, and worked quite well. Maybe Bill want to add a little bit more. Bill, you want to put your camera on? If you can.
Well, I just got back from the gym, so probably not the best state for a visual, but I'm very happy.
That was a good look, Bill.
Hi, Rebecca. No, I mean, for me, it's, I think certainly in the professional sense, those are office-based. I've been working in global teams probably for the past 25 years, as many people have. And technology, certainly over the past 5 years with Teams, Zoom, video conferencing, a lot more collaborative type tools really lent themselves to global team operating. You can't always be on a plane. You can't always have everyone together in the same location. So I think there's a familiarity anyway with the technology, and the big transition was just going back into your home location. For me, I think the more interesting aspect, and certainly in consulting, where you have quite an apprenticeship type model where the graduates are coming through the initial boot camp, almost coming through and really needing that first-hand experience from the mentoring, in effect, from the leadership team and their superiors. I think that is one thing that actually does get lost. And also, typically, those individuals who are new into an organisation, the younger population, generally don't have the infrastructural facilities that those who've been in industry for the past 25 years. I mean, if you did see my camera, I've got a completely self-contained office. I've got all the infrastructure. I've got some very fast broadband. I've got very quiet working environment. And for me, it works extremely well. Whereas others, if you're working off an ironing board in the front room, sharing the same infrastructure or facilities with 3 others in a flat share, then it becomes a lot more complicated. So I think it's one of those, it works well, certainly looking just at the audience today, that those who've had a very a little bit more longer tooth in their career, it probably worked extremely well. And certainly the commute from the McKinsey study for me was one of the biggest bonuses, and more family work-life balance. But for me, I do feel for the younger generation who are coming through into consulting over the past 2 to 3 years.
Yes, Bill, I think they're both extremely well made points. I'd just like to come back to you on the first point you made, just to ask a kind of clarification question. But before COVID, when you were working with your global teams using technology, and I was familiar as well with doing that, did you have regular face-to-face meetings where you'd get on an aeroplane and fly somewhere and meet up, or was it always remote?
No, I mean, it's a real balance, and certainly most of my work has been project related, and you find that for certain board meetings or key meetings like that, generally you want to be in the room. Certain aspects of project-based work as well, when you get into either the deployment or design phase, or some aspects of it where actually the workshopping aspect, if you're doing requirements gathering, that kind of thing, it does warrant being physically on the ground and actually pressing the flesh and actually meeting and greeting and those types of things. But it wasn't, and even just nature of some of the global projects, you don't normally have just one remote location. Often, certainly my roles, we maybe have 3 or 4 headquarter type locations and maybe implementing in 30 or 40 different countries. So you're going to be geographically spread anyway, but so there was a lot more travel, long haul travel, to actually be physically on the ground, but mainly for very specific workshops, meetings, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I completely get that, and I agree with you. I actually suspect that some of those activities you talked about will still have face-to-face meetings if they're easy to get to and not too expensive. But I suspect there's going to be quite a lot of resistance to people going on a long haul flight for anything less than, maybe a week, because it seems like you could just start on Zoom, couldn't you?
Oh, I think that's where a lot of organisations are really adding or weighing up the benefit of the cost associated with travel, certainly long haul, against the actual return and the deliverables which will fall out from a Zoom meeting. And I think people really are questioning whether it's where the value equation is. And for me, I think there's always going to be a need to be on the long haul. For me, I'd always orchestrate my diary to make sure I'm as productive on the ground, maybe visiting 2 or 3 locations as a kind of round trip before coming home. But it'd be more maybe once a month doing 2 or 3, well, once every quarter doing 2 or 3 weeks, as opposed to being daily or weekly going into Europe or something along those lines, where for a very specific meeting or for half a day, it just doesn't really justify the travel time.
No, can't imagine doing that anymore, can you? I see there's a couple of other comments. Where would you like to go next, Antonio?
We have a very similar comment from Alex. He's mentioning that he worked with offshore business analyst, and before and during the COVID, it seems that for him, it was much harder to run workshops before COVID, and that when we enter in COVID, the technology seems to improve significantly. Maybe Alex wants to add a few comments on that.
Yeah, but actually, Alex, you might want to comment on your second comment as well, if you like.
Yeah, sorry, I've taken myself off mute. Hopefully you can hear me. So I was before COVID. So I worked for a company called Infosys. I don't work there anymore. And obviously, well, I'm UK based, but we had offshore BAs. And I'd agreed with my managers that we were going to stretch what the possibilities were for offshore BAs. And previously, the senior BAs, business analysts, who were onshore, had really used the offshore BAs for very much distinct tasks. Quite defined. So, for example, write up the notes for a meeting, or turn this whiteboard photo into a Visio or whatever for the process modelling. Whereas I went straight in, and pre-COVID, as I say, I'd agreed it with the managers. The BA is going to run the workshops from start to finish. They're going to do all the challenging, they're going to do all the modelling, and they will do the modelling on the screen like they would do on a whiteboard. And it worked pretty well. There were some challenges, as I said, before COVID, but the moment COVID hit, it was like a transformation. And I to be honest, whilst technology improved, I put a bit of it down to behavioural. I think the client was a little bit resistant before, and partly for some of the job security reasons that you touched on. Of, well, if our job can be done in the UK, can be done in India, well, why bother keeping it in the UK at all? And I must admit that's I've seen that elsewhere on some job boards. I monitored the jobs in Ireland. I was interested in moving to Ireland at one stage, and I was observing them sort of commenting, "Oh, crikey, our jobs could just go to India now." And it's like, well, yeah, that's what happened with jobs from the UK going to Ireland once upon a time. So yeah, I thoroughly disagree that you need to press the flesh. I've seen all the things, the behavioural things happen, challenging people.
I think that's really very interesting, Alex. And I'm particularly interested in your behaviours changed overnight. I completely agree with that. I mean, just really small things like before COVID, I didn't like being on video on the phone. Why would I do that? People could see me. Now I think it's odd if I don't see the person's face and I just have a audio call. That's really weird, isn't it? So I agree. I think behaviours change very, very quickly, and people got much better at being polite and participating properly online.
Definitely. The politeness, it was unreal. I was asking some of my friends and family during the breaks and the COVID, it's like, is it just me, or have people just become a lot nicer since COVID? It was bizarre what happened. It was like, where previously I was used to arguments breaking out and just watching and just standing there going, what the hell are you two doing? And now never happens almost. It does, but almost never.
I think that's a really interesting point. And then I skipped over, Simon has put up a link here to an FT article, which I haven't seen, about supporting young consultants in a hybrid world. Do you want to say a bit more about that, Simon?
Yes, so just quickly go to the article. I mean, it is largely about behaviours and skills, isn't it? I mean, it's not that we can't do things in a hybrid world, or we can't do things online, but it's about how we do them, the attitudes and the skills that we bring to them. So for instance, the article talks about how EY's team has established 6 behaviours for its managers to take into account when dealing with young learners, and the kind of basic things that any kind of team leaders would do: finding opportunities for people to learn from each other, using networks to help people make contacts, communicating the expectations of learning on the job. So I agree with Alex. It is about the behaviours and the skills and the attitudes, but also perhaps the underlying tech. And I think one of the things I struggle with, and particularly because I work a lot in the not-for-profit sector, if organisations don't have digital infrastructure, if they don't have good connectivity, if they don't have staff with the skills, that's when issues can crop up. But if you can make all those things work, and obviously that's the job of an IT consultant, then it's pretty good. I think the only thing I would say is, and again, this is probably about my own skill set as much as anything else, that thing around kind of trust building is probably a little bit harder with somebody you haven't met face to face, just from kind of personal experience. The ability to look someone in the eyes on a screen is not quite the same as the ability to look someone in the eyes across a table from 2 meters or less. And that informal interaction of, you might have a very robust conversation with one of your colleagues and then go for a coffee and a croissant or something. And so those are the only 2 things, which they're not irresolvable. I think they're just a little bit more challenging, and maybe we need a bit more time to. So
I agree. And just to come back, so did you say that Ernst & Young have put 6 leadership behaviours in place? I didn't quite hear that.
Sorry, no, there's 6 specific behaviours for managers to take into account when dealing with young learners. Right. So they're not leadership behaviours. They're about kind of managers' responsibilities to the people that work for them.
Which, to be fair, they probably should have had before, or probably did have before.
Yeah, there's probably just slightly different behaviours, yes.
Yeah. The trust thing is interesting, isn't it? So I mentioned at the beginning of this session, I've recently taken on chairing a big board for the Department for Education. I have met, maybe 3 of the people on the board to date, because we're not meeting face to face, we're meeting virtually. And I think it's slower. I think it takes more time to build relationships with people online. And certainly I'm finding that when it's me and a big group of people, and they all know each other, by the way, because they've been working with each other for quite a while, it is quite difficult to understand how the politics of the group are working, or the communications, or who might be allied with who. That's actually quite difficult to come into as a newbie. And so I'm hoping that we will be able to have some face-to-face meetings in the fullness of time. So Antonio, back to you. Where would you like to go next?
Yes, so I would like to go with, I would like to ask Charlie to chip in. She was commenting on Alex. I think she was quite agree with him. And she also had a question about neurodivergence or neurodiversity post-pandemic.
Good question, Charlie. Do you want to say a bit more?
Hi, yes, I'm so sorry I can't come on camera right now, but I totally love this discussion, and you're bringing up, everyone is actually bringing up so many great points and things that I've been thinking about as I work with enterprise companies as well, and we're all hearing so many different points of view. My question regarding the neurodivergency of, well, just how companies are dealing with neurodivergence is because as you all know, we are in a multi-generational workforce that is becoming ever more complicated because at least before the pandemic, we were all in the office for the most part. But now, not only are we not in the office, but we all have very different ideas about what we want and where we're going. Now, that's just generationally speaking. But then you have the introverts, the extroverts, the ambiverts, the this and that, the people who are, so it's getting more complicated. How, especially when it comes to technologies, are you seeing this playing out post-pandemic, and how are you advising companies and managers to really grapple with this?
So I don't know that people are necessarily at that stage yet. I think some companies might be getting there. Some of you will know that I have a special interest in neurodiversity, and have written and published a couple of articles on people with neurodiverse capability. And one of the reasons I'm interested is because oftentimes people with neurodiverse capability are very suitable to jobs in the IT industry. However, Charlie, you make a really good point. We already knew before the pandemic that some people need different types of working arrangements and different types of support than others. There's been quite a lot said about supporting people from a mental health and wellbeing point of view. And, a different parallel universe. I sat on the board of the City Mental Health Alliance for 3 years. But mental health and wellbeing is not the same as maximising the potential of people with neurodiverse capability. And I think, regardless of the pandemic, I think many organisations are still relatively at the start of a journey about thinking about how can we tap into that capability? How can we make the best of it for the individuals and for the organisation? And how do we make the working environment work? I'm not absolutely sure that COVID has changed that a lot because I'm not sure that many companies were far along that spectrum of thinking before the pandemic. I definitely think it's something that has to be grasped, though. Really, I do. And I don't have further answers. I'd love to know if anybody else has got any thoughts on this.
If no one else chip in, just want to mention the comment. I think is really important. I see that we are having more apps and more solutions to trying to promote mental health in companies. Like, for example, there's a few names like the Headspace or Calm, things like that. However, I think it's a very big issue, and it's important, for example, for everybody, and different people has different preferences to disconnect. And now it's harder to disconnect because you are in the same workspace, you are in the same space that you call home when you are working. So it might, for some people, can be harder to disconnect. And if we don't address that, that may cause that these premium and disadvantages that we get with the life-work balance, it's all go in a reverse way. So you can get anxiety or depression and all kind of problems. So
yeah. I mean, I think I agree with you. That's a slightly different point. And certainly my experience of working, particularly in the first kind of 6 to 9 months of the pandemic, was not only did I feel like I was never not on, I was always, at my computer. Every half hour or so, I was completely changing what I was talking about. So, you'd have like a 30-minute or maybe a 45-minute meeting, and each meeting was on something completely different. And whereas in the office, you might have that transition from room to room or building to building, or, at least go and get a coffee or something. When you're just, closing one Zoom call and literally starting up the next one, you never have that. And I did find I got really tired. And I'm sure that's common for lots of people in the early days. And, I think we all worked out our own coping strategies for that. And those people that didn't work out their own coping strategy, they're the ones we really, really, really need to be worrying about now and keeping a close eye on, and really finding out whether they, how they do it. For me, I knew I had to have an hour outside every day, even in the pouring rain, just had to go, not be, at my desk for 12 hours a day. However, it's different for different people, and it's a really important point, Antonio.
Yeah,
I see that Jaideep has put up something.
Yes. Jaideep, do you want to comment? I think it's a really interesting point. I think you are bringing, we have been talking about advantage, and you are finding some challenges. So can you tell us more about the pains?
Yeah. So my challenge has been, we've got about 40 people working, and a huge lot in the junior space. So when we went online, suddenly the projects and things where it was all okay, well set, communication channels and all that kind of stuff, it went sort of all right, a little bit of hiccups. But when we started new projects or a newer team together, especially with youngsters, it all struggled. They struggled heavily. They didn't know where to go. They didn't have a habit of, kind of asking for things, going onto the channels, using them. And then we had to spend a huge lot of time to sort of get them all together. Gradually, we started doing certain, coffee meetings and, where natural exchange of information happened in the company before. And a lot of important stuff happens there. You know about what's going on in the other side of things, who's new joiner, what to go for them to ask for, what is their expertise, and all of that used to automatically happen, which stopped. And then we had to figure out a way that, people should get all this information, which is not project related maybe, but even otherwise, and it was really challenging for especially the junior ones or the new teams getting built. And, there was a lot of problem there. So we solved it, but yeah.
And did you get over it? Did you find ways that you could make it work?
Yes. So initially it was a bit of a chaos, but then we started a lot of other meetings, HR initiatives and coffee meetings. And, we tried to mix people a lot more. So we had at least a couple of non-project meetings for different groups and interests, and, so that they meet, talk to each other, and maybe certain, certain general topic on, even what you did, in your spare time, something that will prompt them to come back to the, and share a few things, and then they knew each other well, because even with just 40 people, it's not a huge lot of number, it's not a big company, but still we had this problem on how do we share about each other or the things that are happening in my project or your project, and, lots of little things that you obviously know when you go to the same office automatically didn't happen. So we had to do those things, deliberately.
Yeah, no, I think this starting new things is an interesting thread, and I'd be interested if anybody has comments on this. So I agree with you. I think you can keep things going that are already going. And if you introduce one new person or two new people, then you can kind of accommodate that. I think it is different when you start a brand new project and you've got a new team coming together who have never worked together before. And that is our lives, isn't it, in consultancy? That is what happens. And if you're not careful, what you get in your new project is you get 2 or 3 people who have worked together before, and they automatically kind of band together and, do stuff together. And then, it's difficult for the rest of them. So I think that that is more difficult. I see somebody's put asynchronous communications, Charlie. I agree with you, Charlie, on that. But I also think, Jaideep, that you talked about, you know, reinventing those coffee meetings for online as opposed to, you know, actually meeting face to face. So it's so important. I know a company that each Friday afternoon with their most junior people, they get them on a Teams call, and they get them to present something that they've done that week and get other people to talk about, well, how would they have coped with that situation? And again, this is all about those peers, junior peers, learning how each other work, how they make decisions. You've got somebody more senior who is kind of, who can intervene if they need to, but it's really about them getting to know each other.
So one thing I would say here, you know, we started like employee of the month, or, you know, more like know your peers or know your fellow workers. And then we did in these weekly meetings, we picked up one guy who would then talk about himself, what he does and what his project is. So it's automatically a bit more social, to be honest, but his skills and what people can reach out to him, what are his interests. But we started doing that in a organized fashion, you know.
So one of the things we did at Deloitte in the past of the company that I worked in, right at the beginning of the pandemic, is each of the leaders, each of the partners in the business would take it in turns to write a piece each week, which was effectively like a diary. But this is what I've been doing, and this is what I've been feeling like. And it included things like, and I've got to work out how to do the shopping, and I want to go out on my bicycle, and, you know, as well as the work stuff. And then gradually over time, we started introducing more and more people talking about, well, what was their life like? What were they actually doing? What was their work-life balance? And what were the challenges? And those little like snippets into what people were really experiencing real time, that helped. It helped such a lot to help us all feel like we were all part of the same team with the same endeavour and the same challenges.
I think in the consultancy, we have an even tougher challenge than in most other contexts, because we're not just talking about starting a new project. You're very often talking about starting with a new client, potentially a new industry, certainly new business context, new business processes, and with a team that's probably a mixture of consultants and client staff and consultants who haven't actually worked together. So the whole process of how you actually get to familiarize yourself with the job, with the team, with how you're going to work with each other, who's who. It is just an ongoing challenge, I think, to do that time and time again. Of course, every time you have a new assignment, the chances are you're going to repeat that process again. And
I'd go back to Bill's comments earlier, Simon, because I genuinely think that to leapfrog some of the challenges, if it is possible to get at least some people into a room, you're going to just go faster. It's not that you can't get there, you can get there, but I think you probably will go faster. That project initiation phase, particularly with a new client, is where I think, my personal view, is that's when you're most likely to want that face-to-face interaction, that storming and forming and norming piece. Yeah.
I have a comment from Alex on the same line. He's mentioning the informal relationship, which is in the same line that we are commenting. And I think in my experience, which is the biggest challenge that we have, these minutes that we have in the after a minute in the coffee breaks, or to talk with more people. Alex, do you want to tell us a little bit more?
I do.
I think you covered it. I was going to, and I think you covered it very well. As I say, it may be that I've been lucky that the people I've been working with were, you know, I don't know, was it experienced, skilled, whatever the words, whatever the case was, that we made the effort on the informal side, so that, you know, that storming, forming and norming. And this is where, for me, the experience has been, it's like quite bizarre how polite and how actually there hasn't been that storming element where there's been proper fallouts. There've certainly been some difficulties, but I think maybe, I don't know, perhaps I've been lucky with the maturity of people. I'm not sure why that's not happened.
Yeah, I do think you're right, though, Alex. You do have to make an effort, don't you? You have to build those informal relationships. And, you know, if you have a new team coming together, you do have to watch those maybe 3 or 4 people who've worked together for the last 5 years and all know how each other act. You have to watch that. I think it's important.
Definitely.
There were a couple of issues, topics that you mentioned before, and I thought that they were quite interesting. So maybe that helps everybody to join, to chip in. One of the things that you commented, Rebecca, was about the geographical reshaping the geographies that we have. So if we don't need to work, and I think was either Alex or Bill at the beginning who mentioned if we don't need to work anymore and we can delegate responsibility to a team entirely in India, that team is going to go to India. So if we are working from home, we don't need to be anymore in the country. We don't stay in London or near to London, or maybe even in the country. We prefer to go to a warmer place. So does anyone want to share experience in that area?
I'd love to hear more about that. Any comments on this?
Can
I say something here?
Yeah.
So I myself from India and worked both places, UK and India. So again, you know, it's about, I don't believe that it is 100% possible to just completely put everything there, wherever in India or some other locations. You know, you got to know people well, you got to know business well, you got to have that kind of communication. I call it communication, you know, it's not about your fluency in English or what kind of super words you use. It's really able to understand the situation and the people around you. I don't think that is 100% possible just without any presence or, you know, vicinity with the people that you're serving. Absolutely, it doesn't work. I mean, that's my experience. I have little experience compared to some of the other people here, but you got to have certain connection, certain understanding, and that is fully, you know, just doing it from offshore. I don't think that works. You know, that's my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, well, certainly my background dealing with the public sector for the last 20 years, you know, I've never found it possible to build an entire team to serve a government organisation that isn't from the country. You know, perhaps that's an extreme. And there are roles for specialists to play, and sometimes there are roles for leaders to play. The leader has to have something worth saying. But generally speaking, the people who are doing the work need to come from the country, because you're so right, Jaideep. They need to understand the culture, the organisation situation, then the nuances of the conversation, which it's very difficult. It's very difficult to be a good consultant without being able to do that. So I agree with you, but I noticed we've got in the chat, I see you all in the Caribbean, and then somebody who's saying hello from Canada. I'm going to ask the person in Canada to speak in a minute, but I did want to say that I noticed in doing the research for this discussion this evening, one company, and I can't remember who it was, but one company are now offering the opportunity to work from an international location for up to 4 weeks a year as part of their flexible offer. And I thought, that's really sensible, because if you took a 2-week holiday anyway, and you could work for 4 weeks, then it would say, well, you could go and work from Australia for 6 weeks, couldn't you, if you wanted to, and you were prepared to get up in the middle of the night. But LL in Canada, do you want to talk about your situation?
Hi, call me LJ.
Oh, LJ, sorry, I couldn't quite see that in the chat. Sorry, LJ.
Ola Hudinsky. It's a perfectly normal British name.
It's a perfectly normal British name.
So, yeah, I'm based in Canada. I'm in Ontario, just outside of Toronto. And I was last winter in Toronto itself. And there was a couple of chaps who had moved down. They were connected with ITIL, and they could work remotely. So they moved down to Jamaica and were working there. But they came back when the company they were contracted with started humming and hawing about paying Toronto rates when they were based in Jamaica.
Mm.
And I've also heard the same with some of the Canadian companies who, if you move, it's like moving out of London, moving out of Toronto. So if you move into, say, Somerset, where the cider is lovely, and housing is cheaper than London, well, we'll pay you a different rate to if you were actually in London.
Mm. Yeah, I think you're right. I think those conversations are to come, LJ.
Yeah, well, they've already been ongoing for a while over here.
Yeah. And most of the big consultancy organisations were already moving large numbers of people out of London before the pandemic. And my observation is that that shift has continued, absolutely continued. And if anything happens out of the levelling up reform programme, we ought to see more activity outside London. And I would applaud that. I would, given that I live down in Somerset, as you say. But there is a question there, isn't there? Well, what about London waiting? Should you have that anymore? And what about the travel expenses when you do? If you're choosing to, I know people who've chosen to move to beautiful Northumberland during the pandemic, but who's going to pay for them to travel to the office on the occasions that they do travel to the office? It's their choice to live there, but it's very expensive to travel. So yeah, some of that I think the HR organisations will need to be thinking about when, as I talked about earlier, if they're designing high quality jobs, and they will be for people that want an element of that remote, or mainly remote, or at least the flexibility to choose, then they're going to need to think about these things.
I just have a quick question about, I'm in New York, in the New York area, and I've been sort of loving the remote thing and being home. And so I go to a lot of events, as I'm sure before the pandemic, as I'm sure many of you did, networking events, conferences, where we learn new things, but mostly go to network and to maybe get new business, of course. So my question is now, I got this invite from Bloomberg. I get invited to all of their events in New York City at their headquarters. And it looks like they're back. They're back to doing live events, which is just, to me, shocking. It's like, wow, it's really happening. And the choice was, do you do live or do you do virtual? Right? Because now they're giving you a choice. My inclination is to just always just do virtual. My question is, because I know that may not be obviously my best interest, how are you guys thinking about returning to industry events as you work remotely? Because certainly now that they're coming back, conferences and workshops and everything, panels, there's more of a pressure to go to them. So, how are you dealing with that? And is it unrealistic to just not want to go to any of them?
I just think that's such a great question, Charlie. From my own personal point of view, I attended my first business dinner last month in 2 years. It was a BCS dinner, and there were 13 of us there at the restaurant. And at one point, I thought to myself, good heavens, I'm absolutely exhausted. It must be really late. And I looked at my watch and it was 10 to 9. And I think the point here is that I'm totally unused to anymore being in that kind of environment and the energy that it takes. I have, either I've got very old during the COVID or I just got not used to managing my energy in that way. I want to go to some events live. I do want the choice, and I certainly don't want to go to all of them. What I'm very interested in is how we're going to manage the technology in situations where you've got some people in the room and some people not in the room, and you want the people who are not in the room not to feel like second-class citizens. And this isn't just about networking events, it's also about doing business. And, it's not going to work, is it, having a bunch of people in the room looking at each other and then another bunch of people on a screen on the wall on the side, kind of, not really participating. I think this is something that we're all going to really, really have to think about, because we're going to have cope with people in the room and people remotely equally participating going forward. Regarding the networking events, you know, I suspect that people will go to networking events if they're close to home. So maybe you'll go to the ones in New York, but you know, you won't get on a plane to go to one in another country or another big city.
So again, can I just say something quickly? You know, again, it's about if you knew people before, or you're visiting the same group, and then you went online, it's easier to keep those connections, those relationships maintained like that. But newer things, you wouldn't know the person unless you really, you know, meet him in person, see him. It's a lot different level of communication, don't you think so? Even with video, it's a lot better, but without, you know, if he's in front, the way he dresses, the way he acts, you suddenly know a lot of things about the person, and you tend to either want to talk to them or not. You know, you suddenly know all these things. So
yeah, I think that's right, and I also think that in an office environment or a face-to-face environment, you kind of forget how many people there are that you don't see that often, and you don't maybe know them that well. But actually, every time you see them, you get some value from the conversation with them. And so, you know, you're not going to make an appointment to have a Zoom with them because the interactions you've had with them have been random and unexpected and very rich, probably, because they've been random and unexpected. So I think that randomness of conversation and meeting people in a face-to-face environment, that's the thing. I think it's very difficult to measure the value of that to an organization. That's why people do networking. And I suspect that we won't know quite how much we've lost of that for a while. I think it could take a while. And I'm not quite sure how you build that back, if people are not. You know, it's very, very difficult to create random connections in a virtual world. Or maybe Meta have all the answers and they'll tell us in a couple of months, and we'll all be wearing special virtual reality goggles and we'll all know how to do it. But I'm cynical about that.
If I could just add one little thing to everything that you guys have said, which is amazing. I also work in the event space as well in tech. And I don't know if you've ever heard of BizBash, David Adler, who's like pretty much like the godfather of the corporate events industry, right? He's been around for 40 years and he's always at the forefront of what's happening. I just listened to his podcast called, I think it's called BizBash, I think. And it's really interesting what I've been hearing coming from the hardcore corporate events experts, you know, in the industry as well. They're just as torn. They're excited. They're ambivalent. There's a lot of discussion, but just as early as last week, I heard him and a few experts in the industry saying, we don't know what the heck is going to happen. We just like, what is going on? You know, so it's, and to everything that you just said, it's not just the technology. It's not just the physicality of the space and the making the logistics work. It's the not knowing how to get people to interact with each other in a way that's as fruitful as it was before.
Yeah, really well put.
It probably is time to wrap it up now. Anyway, it has been absolutely wonderful, a great conversation, and these are really important challenges for everybody to tackle. How to make the best of the brave new world that we are presented with.
Yeah, well, I'll be back in another 5 years. We can have a conversation again and see what's actually happened, because I'd love to know.
Did you want to move on to your final slide? I think you had a couple of links or something.
Oh, no, it's just for people if you want the pack later, do ask for it. On the final slide, I've put up the links of the studies that I read in preparation for this discussion, just in case anybody wants to read them, really. There you go. Yeah, not terribly exciting to look at, but that's you know, those are the studies that I referenced while I was speaking. But you know, there's not that much out there yet, and I do think we'll see more.
So I think we should call it a day. Thank you very much, everybody who has participated and joined us in the audience. Extremely large thanks to Rebecca. A very interesting session. And as you were saying, Rebecca, it'd be great to revisit this and see what the world looks like.
Exactly. It's been my pleasure. I love talking to this particular specialist group, as I said. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm sure we'll invite you time and time again. Anyway, let's call it a day. I'm ready for some food and drink. So, unfortunately, we have to have virtual wine and sandwich. And see you all sometime soon, I hope.